go over the house rules before we really start. So please mute your microphone, stop sharing video, and make sure your name appears on MS Teams as you were registered to acquire your CPE points. The presentation will probably record it, but we don't know if we can publish it yet. And if you have questions, you can raise the hand features, but better type it in the chat box. There is a place for questions at the end of the presentation. Then upcoming events I want to note, we go also with roundtables, 5th of October in Breukelen, live in Van der Valk, encryption for cloud services as protection against international transfers. And 19th of October in Eindhoven will be in Dutch MKB-ondernemers te verleiden om basis digitale weerbaarheid op orde te brengen van Cyberweerbaarheidscentrum Limburg. And don't forget the risk event coming up on 16th of November. Then I will introduce your speaker, but only very small because Federico can better present himself. So I will give over the word to Federico. In other places, I would say give him a big applause, but just give it over and have a good meeting today.
Thank you very much. Yes, good evening, everyone. It started raining in the meantime. Best weather ever. I will share the presentation now. I hope you can see it. Just 1 second. Do you see the presentation? Is it clear? It's a black screen at the moment.
It's a black screen, what I see.
Very good, very good. All right. All right, good evening, everyone. I want to start the presentation saying, time ago, a guru on the cloud security domain told me something that I will never forget, something that made me thinking about cybersecurity and also cloud security in a different way. And today, I'm so proud to talk about journey towards Schrems II compliance. My name is Federico Casano, and I'm cybersecurity advisor at ABN AMRO Bank. Please also let me know if you hear me well, because there is rain very loud. Gilbert,
I hear you very well, no problem.
All right, thank you. So I assume you're all familiar with Schrems II. The name comes from Max Schrems, an activist in Austria, who started a battle against Facebook Ireland. And the battle he started was indeed to assign more privacy to us as consumers against most of the big techs. He noticed that in the United States especially, there is much surveillance. He noticed that government can access personal data that is stored and transferred to American large companies. The 16th of July 2020, the European Court of Justice invalidated the Privacy Shield. The Privacy Shield was a framework in place that allowed the transfer of data between the European Union and United States of America. It's not the first time that such a framework gets invalidated. There was a different framework before Privacy Shield. It was called Safe Harbor. But this time, one of the biggest differences is that standard contractual clauses are still valid, but in order to process data, in order to transfer it outside of the European Economic Area, which means European Union and also Liechtenstein, Norway, and Iceland, you need to evaluate the level of protection adopted by the third party, the third country where you transfer the data. If the level of protection is not adequate, then additional measures need to be adopted. Or you can incur fines, or you need to stop the transfer, obviously. And for most of you who wonder, the fine can be up to 20 million or 4% of your annual revenue. And in case of Google, for instance, we are talking about 6 billion. At the moment, checking the news from the European Data Protection Board, you will see there are rumors of a fine for Google of 6 million. And although for Google might be just some spare money, for other companies might be really a lot. In this presentation, I will focus on this corner, the corner where you see adopt extra measures. How can we help from CISO to adopt extra measures in case there is a transfer of data outside European Economic Area? So it's not just United States, it can also be India, it can also be South Africa, Brazil, or any other country outside the European Economic Area. You might wonder, why Schrems II? Well, maybe as a joke, we should ask the Verizon customer who speak and NSA is listening to their conversations. And before we proceed, I also wanted to share this picture. As a joke again, I say a legend in the privacy domain on the left and Max Schrems on the right. But indeed, it was a pleasure to meet Max Schrems and also share with him ideas that I will present to you during this presentation today. So who is affected? 3 parties. Teams migrating to the cloud, product owners of SaaS applications, and also the organization-wide, especially if a SaaS-first strategy is implemented. And again, I am focusing on you, colleagues in other companies who face issues against Schrems II. So obviously, if you have a team that wants to migrate to the cloud, now you need to take into account also Schrems II in terms of compliance. Can the team migrate to the cloud? Where are the transfer happening? Which applications are you using? Which platform? But also the product owners of SaaS applications, obviously. If you own a SaaS application, the SaaS application might be hosted, the servers might be hosted in the United States, for instance. Also, you might need to check if the SaaS application has any other third party that is transferring data outside of the European Economic Area. And last but not least, point number 3, many organizations nowadays are applying a SaaS-first strategy. Is it still valid now with all the issues that we see around compliance, around privacy? Should we go back to on-premise? And I keep this as a question mark for all of us. So then what are the challenges for CISO when data is transferred outside of the European Economic Area? Well, obviously, when you procure cloud provider services, you might face some challenges. It might be the case if you have Azure, AWS, Google Cloud. But also, if you do business outside of the European Economic Area, let's say that you have a partner in the United States and you need to transfer the data to the United States in order to process the data. In that case, you're still doing a transfer of your personal data. And there you might face challenges. And the third point, also important indeed for us, legal measures are not enough. If legal measures are not enough to enforce compliance, we need to apply technical measures to protect the transfers of personal data. But on the other end, also the technical controls cannot guarantee compliance. We can obviously, and we'll see them later, implement encryption, key management, and so on and so forth. But, and we all are familiar with this, if you have a lockdown, if you work remotely from home. As an example, if you have developers in India working from home because of COVID, you cannot guarantee the same controls, the same technical controls that you might have at the office. And this is a big challenge, in my opinion. So before we go through the technical solutions that I propose in this webinar, let's focus on potential strategic solutions. One of the strategic solutions might be to use an EEA provider with infrastructure in the EEA region, which includes, as I said before, European Union member states, but also Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. Second solution might be to use providers from countries with adequacy decision, but only, obviously, if you can verify that GDPR protections are respected. Countries with adequacy decision, for you to know, are Switzerland, New Zealand, Canada, Israel, and many more. So there are effectively many other countries outside of the European Union which offer the same level of protection that the GDPR claims to offer. Third point, you can also use an open source software, for instance, Odoo ERP, instead of Oracle or Salesforce, and use it on-premise on your own server. The fourth one, use an open source software solution hosted in an independent EU cloud provider. And I don't like to mention any vendor, but if you search for OVH Cloud, you will see that there are also now emerging competitors in Europe against those huge giants in the United States. And obviously, last but not least, the more aggressive solution is to develop your IT solution, your software, and also use an on-premise hosted independent EU cloud provider. Very aggressive solution, but it might be a solution. Now, I would like to introduce to you this use case, the investigation that we did at ABN AMRO against our biggest cloud provider. I will depict in this slide the journey that we made, so maybe you can also get some inspiration or some indeed knowledge from the journey that we did. And I must say it was a very long journey, very challenges. But let's go through all the points. The first one, verify the transfers. Know your international data transfers and transfer tools. Where are you transferring your data? But also, which tools are you using? Are the tools adopting encryption, for instance? And then, only once you have an inventory of all the transfers, you can assess the legislation in the country where the personal data is transferred. And not only, make sure, please, not only the transfer that is direct, such as I'm transferring data to a company in Europe, but then you see that the same company in Europe will also transfer the data to the United States. So also make sure that you follow along all the chain. One remark here, before I move to point number 3, in case you are transferring data to a country with adequacy level of protection, let's say that you are transferring data to Canada and the data is only transferred through United States, that's fine. That's not an issue in terms of Schrems II, as long as you implement end-to-end encryption. Third point, evaluate controls. ABN AMRO implementation, obviously, of the cloud provider services, is based on a best practices controls. But are the controls that we implement now effective also in terms of privacy and compliance? Are they enough? And they are valid today, but will they be valid tomorrow as well? And make sure as well that you interview the vendor, interview the engineers, focus on really interesting aspects for cybersecurity, very technical, such as key management. Because at the end, if you have encryption in place, but the vendor can access your keys, then they can still access your personal data. And keep legal experts in the loop as well. What we did, we tried to understand if the FISA requests are coming from, let's say, requests for individuals, or if the requests are for the enterprise level. I will give an example. First of all, FISA requests are requests that the government, United States government, releases in order to protect against threats, right? We're talking about threats and not crimes. So that means that if there is the impression that the government, the country might be attacked by terrorists or really any other threat, it might request big techs or other big corporates in the United States to give access to personal data. Personal data that will not be US citizens' data, but it can be data from other countries. Otherwise, that would be against the Constitution in the United States. So in theory, they can access data from Europe. Make sure to understand if the requests are just for individuals, let's say me using my Gmail account, or if they are for Outlook for enterprises, for instance. Because if it is just me, Federico Casano, using my Gmail account, for you as an enterprise, as a company, will be different than your administrators, for instance, and the software, the business software that you use in your company. 3.B, trust the cloud service provider. I should have said trust but verify. As I mentioned before, FISA requests, understand for who the FISA requests are. But also, the cloud provider implements enough safeguards to prevent unwanted access to client data. That's true, right? But what are these controls? The vendor might have controls that could have been lifted to access personal data in case required by the country. So understand, and we did the really long discussions, understand if the actions that the vendor can take are proportional or disproportional to the law. Because if they are disproportional in a court of justice, you will win, right? Even if they are asked to transfer the data to the government. But if instead, if they don't need to hack their system, as an example, they will be proportional to the law. So make sure that indeed you keep also legal expert involved and you really try to understand what are the controls that the cloud provider implements. In conclusion, extensive set of controls is in place. However, additional monitoring needs to also be adopted. Prevent undesired elevation of privileges. For instance, with monitoring, if there is an elevation of privileges, is it something that is legitimate? And continuously monitor also the controls. It's important that you do so because indeed the controls that you have in place now might not be effective tomorrow. And last bullet point, which is often underestimated, be ready to terminate the transfer of your data. Do you have alternatives? Or do you have this phenomenon of vendor lock-in? So we talk extensively about potential solutions at strategic level, challenges, and also the journey that we did with our biggest cloud provider. What I would like now to share with you are 4 key solution areas and also technical solutions, indeed more perhaps in details, that I would recommend. The areas are four: technology, legal, procurement, and organization. But let's go into details. First one, technology. Obviously, make sure that you adopt technical solutions such as data minimization, data retention, and also periodic access reviews. And with data minimization, I mean obviously to minimize the types of data that you transfer or you store. Is that data necessary? And for how long do you store it? Do I need to keep it years? Do I need to keep the backups years in the data center? And also periodically review who is accessing the data. Second point, SaaS technical requirements. We will go through them in a bit. And third point is automate. Whenever it is possible, automate. Especially if you're having a SaaS strategy, right? Maybe you are a big corporate, right? You have thousands of vendors, or even if you're a smaller company, you have still tens, hundreds of vendors. You cannot assess all the transfers first in a manual way. It would be very complicated. And secondly, also it's difficult to evaluate the safeguards that you have in place. It's obviously easier to do it for yourself, but when you want to evaluate requirements, controls that the vendors are implementing, that might be more complicated. So automate in terms of questionnaires. Playbook one could be evaluate where the data transfers are happening. Send these questionnaires to your product owners. Send these questionnaires also to the vendors. Playbook two might be evaluate the controls that are in place internally, your product owners again, but also your vendors. Now, and this might be perhaps the most tricky part. What are the technical requirements, the technical controls that I can implement internally to guarantee a certain level of compliance? But also, what can be the requirements that I require indeed to my vendors? I group them in 6 categories: encryption, key management, identity and access management, everything as a code, logs and monitoring, but also review of audit reports. First one, encryption. You need to encrypt the data in transit. Encrypt data on protocol level, encrypt data in transit over public interconnections, but also make sure that the data is encrypted over private interconnections as well. Data at rest is equally important. Encrypt the locations where the data is stored, for instance, databases, but also don't forget logs. Logs are important as well, right? Because in the logs, you might still potentially store privacy sensitive data, privacy related data. Very important is key management. As I was saying before, if you have encryption, but then you don't have controls of your own keys, then how can you guarantee that the data is secure? Transfer of the data, but also the data at rest. Well, a big requirement is the storage of encryption keys in HSM, hardware security module. If you use Azure, for instance, and you use Azure Key Vault, for those of you who don't know, it's a feature where you can indeed store secrets, but also keys. A feature offered by Azure. And then when you need, you can access the keys in the Key Vault. But the basic version of Key Vault protects the keys only on a software level, not hardware level. That's a big difference. So also make sure that you have this type of conversations with your vendor. Second point, centralized identity and access controls for key access. So make sure indeed that you have controls for IAM in place. Periodically rotate the keys. And don't forget as well to assess solutions on a case by case, especially custom solutions. It might be that you use Azure, and obviously if you have a SaaS provider using Azure, you are very familiar with the solutions adopted, with the technologies. But if a SaaS vendor is using a custom solution, that might require more attention. In a note, I also say you might have a SaaS provider that is hosting the data in co-location in the European Economic Area. Can be, for instance, data centers in Equinix or any other data center provider. In that case, you might ease the controls, just require full disk encryption with key stored in TPM, because we are not storing data outside of European Economic Area. But make sure that you review the physical security section of assurance reports, such as SOC 2 reports. Identity and access management. In theory, and I say this also as a provocation, the companies should be informed of newly created accounts and existing ones. So if there is a new account, especially high-level account, that is created to access your personal data, you should be informed. I understand that's not always possible, but have this conversation with the vendor. Try to see what are the technologies that they implement in order to guarantee a certain level of confidence when we talk about identity and access management. Obviously, again, the secrets needs to be stored securely. Privileged identities should be organized entire concept as well, for you also to have a complete and clear picture of your identities. And privileges on the use of system accounts, such as tokens and secrets, should be periodically reviewed. And if possible, I must say also rotated. Point number 4, everything as code. The idea behind this requirement is that you want to automate, technically wise, as much as possible. You want to avoid manual processes that are not controlled. Because if you have manual processes, those processes might go under the radar, and then you might have escalation of privileges, for instance, that you don't identify. So make sure that all the resources are deployed using code and automated via CI/CD tools. Audit trails are available, which is something that you do reactively, right? But still you have the information at least. We always talk about software. Infrastructure is also very important. You can have infrastructure as code. You can use software tools like Kubernetes, Terraform. Access to also repositories where code is stored should be secure as well. It happened many times, also referring to the last point, that there are secrets that are leaked because they're posted on GitHub or because there are no sufficient controls to protect for unwanted access. Second to last point, I hope you are still with me, logs and monitoring. Again, very important. Operations needs to be logged. Operations that are performed on identities, but also resources. And also, the audit logs must be tamper-proof, obviously. Protect the integrity of the logs. It's information that you might need later. Monitor detection of unwanted and unauthorized elevation privileges. We talked about that already. But also monitor any concern regarding the confidentiality of the company. That should be reported immediately, right? Have you discussed with your vendor what are the SLA in case there is a data breach or any other confidentiality issue? Make sure that you have these conversations. Last point, and then we are done with the SAS requirements. Assurance reports. I know they are very long, they can be boring to be reviewed, but they might have valuable information. And I'm referring especially to SOC 2 Type 2 reports, because the SOC 2 reports Type 1 just provide a snapshot of the controls assessed, while for SOC 2 Type 2, then you will have the controls that are assessed in a time window, let's say 6 months, usually, or 1 year, and then you have an idea of any flaws that in the last 1 year were identified. And obviously, if you see something that is related to encryption and key management, make sure you have an open conversation with your vendor. We talk about technology. Let's talk about legal and privacy now. CAI rating is not enough nowadays. We need to consider also P rating. You might have an application that is medium in terms of risk for the CAI rating, but very high in terms of P, privacy, for the rating. And in that case, you would definitely need to implement controls that you wouldn't have implemented otherwise. So make sure to understand what is your P level for your applications, and also then make sure that you organize the applications, you do the inventory, you use the tools that you normally use for GRC, for instance, to have a complete picture of what are the products, what are your resources in terms of privacy. Where P1 could be marketing information, till a P level 3 with sexual orientation, gender, race, and so on and so forth. Second point is transparency reports based on the P rating. If I recall correctly, in 2015, Twitter was the first company in the world to release transparency reports. Transparency reports provide to the public information of any request that was received by the government, from the government, in order to access personal data. So then you can also have benchmarks in place. You can say, based on this industry or based on this country, I see that this company, this vendor, has only received 2 FISA requests, if we're talking about the United States, while this other vendor has received 10 FISA requests, and you have a benchmark of 2. So then you might decide to exclude that vendor or have follow-ups, additional controls, because that vendor might be more prone to be required to share data with the government. Point number 3, in the 4 categories, if you recall, of where we should focus in terms of solutions. Obviously, reach out to your vendors. Do it immediately. Vendors should be presented with questions to evaluate their compliance with your requirements. And I know vendors might have thousands of questionnaires already. They might not have the time to reply to your questions. Try to have effective questions, limited questions. If you want to present requirements that are technical cybersecurity requirements to your vendor, make sure that you also add a description, an explanation. Make it easy for your vendors, and they will also be obviously happy to collaborate with you. At least happier, let's put it that way. Keep Schrems questions part of negotiations and contract. I say in this slide, legal plus CISO. We tend to work in silos. Bigger companies do, right? But also the smaller. Don't do it. It's really important that you involve legal, CISO, procurement, compliance, privacy. All of us should be involved, because Vendors, for instance, might indeed be presented with questions that are more legal, such as data transfer, such as visa request, problematic laws, adequacy level of encryption or protection, pardon me, etc., etc. But you might also have from CISO technical requirements. So then you also need to explain to legal what do you require. The legal needs to explain to you what they require. And keep this part of the negotiation. If you have a new contract, indeed, make sure that you have Schrems II part of your new contract. But also if you do acquire, let's say, a new product. Organization is the fourth key area where I would like to raise the attention. Capability center. Obviously, CISO cannot do it alone. We are always understaffed. We know the story, right? There are not enough cybersecurity professionals out there. So make sure, at least this is my suggestion, to create a capability center. A center that is responsible to collect evidence from the vendors, but also internally with your teams, and include, obviously, again, the evidence collected to your GRC tools, governance tools. The same capability center might also be responsible to review the playbooks. So again, if you recall, before I said playbooks automation, if you send questionnaires to the vendors about data transfers, where the data is transferred, those what are the controls in place, in that case, they might do the first review, or they might do the review and involve you if they don't have enough technical knowledge. Because at the end, this capability center could be a sub-team in CISO dedicated to this, or it might be a different group in your organization that was trained by CISO experts. So they might not have the same knowledge that you have, but you might, day by day, step by step, provide to them the same knowledge that you have specifically on this subject. And awareness and knowledge, very important that you share this with your product owners. Your company, we went through that, right? I speak for experience. We had to slow down our business because of Schrems II. And I guess everyone had to have a similar approach, at least to have discussions, about Schrems II, what are the impacts, So make sure that you increase awareness with your product owners, because they will be more willing to collaborate first, but also if there is a team that wants indeed to procure a new service or renew the contract with a vendor, they will now also include Schrems II in their conversations. And obviously, this, I humbly say, applies to cybersecurity in general. Buy-in from management is very important. I said before, we cannot do it alone. Make sure that you have a steerco that includes indeed the management level from all the different departments: legal, privacy, cybersecurity, etc., etc. To conclude, what are the lessons learned? Painfully, I must say, Schrems II is not merely a legal and privacy issue. I hope I conveyed this message today, but it is a CISO important issue as well. And while we might have legal first, second is CISO. And Schrems II is a company-wide issue. It's not only for us, it's not only for CISO experts, right? We really need to tackle it in a strategic level. And lesson 4, cloud-specific controls, automation, and dedicated teams help. I said before, capability center can really help you to speed up the process together with automation And cloud-specific controls such as encryption and key management can give you more confidence, right? It's hard to say in cybersecurity, I guarantee 100% of security and compliance, but you will know now that with some controls in place, you can obviously guarantee more compliance. And I started this webinar at the beginning saying, a guru in the cloud security domain told me something that I will never forget, something that made me thinking about cybersecurity in a different way. Well, if you're curious about what this person told me, I'm sorry, but this is private information. Because the question isn't what do we want to know about people, it's what do people want to tell about themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Federico. I've seen one person who's raised hand for a question, and I encourage everybody to raise more questions. Anita Ruigrok, I saw your raised hand. You're first. If you want to unmute your microphone and put your question here, please. Probably it could be also that you raised hand. Yeah?
Yeah.
Are you there,
unmuted,
Anita?
but I was muted again. Can you hear me, Federico?
Yes, I can hear you. I cannot see you, unfortunately, but I can hear you.
Ah. I have a question. When you talk about key management and encryption and so on, how do you deal with data that's being processed? Because usually you don't process encrypted data. Mm-hmm. Is there also a risk there?
Yes, no. Very good question. Also, first, thank you for asking the question. I don't have a solution to that yet, really honestly. And I spoke with Schrems in person. I asked him as well, but also to other experts in the privacy sector and cybersecurity sector. Is there any solution effectively to mitigate the situation where you need to process the data? Because let's say that you have indeed data that you transfer to the United States to your cloud provider, you have control of the keys and you have encryption, but there might still be a situation where they need to process the data, and in that case, they might see your personal data. There are solutions actually under investigation, such as homomorphic encryption. If you have homomorphic encryption, it's still state of the art, but the solution claims that you can manipulate the data without decrypting it. So in that case, the cloud provider might manipulate the data that is encrypted, and you only access the decrypted data. So that might be potentially a solution. But what you see from the big techs nowadays is that they have data centers in Europe. So they will tell you it's not anymore an issue. We are not transferring data to the United States. You will transfer the data only to European countries. That's true to some extent only. And by the way, this is not something new, right? Especially companies like Netflix, they are very famous for this. They have data centers in Europe, because if you need every time to transfer the data to the United States, you will have long delays. But this is not enough in terms of privacy and compliance, because the company is effectively still an American company, and they will have measures to access the data in Europe. The only solution that could prevent, but companies are still moving very slow, unfortunately, is to have data center in Europe. EU companies such as Microsoft, AWS say, I don't have control of the data center in Europe. I give the data center to a third-party company in Europe. They will manage it. They will give you access to the platform. You have the keys. We only make profit out of it. We provide the services and we ship them to Europe. This might be an approach. I hope this answers your question, Anita.
Yes, thank you.
I see another question. Marcel Klaas, it's your turn.
Please.
You can unmute.
Yes, so in the presentation you mentioned best practices were followed during the implementation. What does this mean for your company? Or was there a certain framework that you used as a guideline or anything else that was used to work alongside getting this implemented?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the question. Obviously, today during the webinar, I speak in terms of advisory and not specifically on what ABN AMRO recommends. So I'm speaking from my point of view. I can say there are out there frameworks that could help you to identify indeed the best practices, such as NIST, also CSA controls, Cloud Security Alliance, but also CIS benchmarks that you can implement in terms of hardening. But if we focus specifically on Schrems II, the categories that you should indeed explore more and more are encryption and key management. And there's a provocation, not for you, but for everyone in the call. Be aware that bring your own key is not always an addition to security, but it might just be compliance. Because once you have control of your root keys, they say that you store them in a key management service such as Azure Key Vault in the HSM, the root keys will be used to generate other subkeys in order to process your data. So the root keys will not be touched, but you will still have other subkeys that will be generated out of them. These subkeys are called DEK keys, D-E-K keys. So again, my advice would be focus on encryption, key management. You can have frameworks that can support you, NIST, for instance. You can have also this presentation that can support you, obviously. And make sure that you keep conversations open with your vendors. I hope this is.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, we have another question from Sandeep Gangaram Pandey. Sandeep?
Can I interrupt before the question? I don't want to sound rude. I wanted to have an additional remark. Pardon me.
Please.
You might have heard, really to have a complete picture today, that the 25th March 2022, a new framework is in place in order to transfer the data to United States in a compliant way. And I say that with inverted commas because it took first 2 years, almost, for the framework to be developed. In the case of Schrems I and not Schrems II, it took 6 months, if I recall correctly, or way less anyway. But the framework, which is called Transatlantic Data Privacy Framework, it's only on paper yet. And you will see, if you speak with experts from European Data Protection Board, for instance, that they don't believe that the framework will be able to guarantee enough compliance to GDPR. And you also hear other people, again, such as Max Schrems, talking about Schrems III again. So this is just to say that the issues that we're facing now will stay for longer. Pardon me if I interrupted the question again, but I wanted to have this addition.
Oh no, that is a very good addition. Personally, I don't believe that it's easy to make a good framework for transfer to America too. So we will see more versions of Schrems, I think. Still, there is a question from Sandeep.
Yeah. Thank you.
Howard.
Yeah, thank you, Federico. Yeah, indeed, my questions regarding what you just mentioned on the encryption, because it's difficult to get that 100% secure, of course. So I had two questions about it. First, you mentioned you don't suggest to use the basic key vault solution of Azure. So you mean the advanced version, I think, right? So where you have indeed a really physical HSM, right?
Please go ahead with the second question. I will get back.
Yeah, so that's my question. So do you recommend indeed a solution where you have not a software base, but a physical based HSM? That's the first question. And the second one is, a few weeks back, another colleague of you gave also this around the square table, where was mentioned that for privacy sensitive information, ABN currently is on hold for migrating towards Azure. So does that imply that even these controls are currently deemed and as is insufficient?
Okay, thank you for the question. First point, yes, I would recommend to use HSM. You name it as advanced key vault. It's called premium, not advanced, but still indeed the same. I would recommend it, yes, if you can, even a dedicated HSM, so not an HSM that is shared with other companies, but your HSM. With all the complicacies, right? Because if you ask vendors, especially small vendors, to have an HSM, and they are not using Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, it might be very complicated for them to implement. But I think we should keep the bar high, right? The risks are millions or billions. So at least let's have high requirements. And then if we cannot meet those requirements, let's have open conversations with our vendors. Obviously, depending on your risk tolerance. For a bank, it might be different than another company. We are highly regulated environment. For other companies, it might be different. But still, I will see it as an issue. And regarding the second part of your question, I am afraid I was not there at the round table. I would prefer not to comment on what my colleague said, as I wasn't there. And also, personally, I wouldn't like to comment on what ABN AMRO is now doing in terms of operations, strategically.
Yeah, thank you.
If you don't mind, thank you.
Yeah, oh, thank you.
Okay, I'm looking. There are no more questions at the moment. Somebody
Well,
else?
in that case, if there's no question, I have another one.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, maybe this is a broad question, but maybe just your personal opinion. So last week there was a publication on AG Connect from some privacy experts in the Netherlands, mostly professors from several universities, regarding the decision from the Dutch government to now also approve AWS as an approved vendor for the government. So they're enhancing or increasing their public cloud embracement, to call it like that. And there was quite some resistance from universities on that topic. It's a bit off topic on this topic maybe, but do you have some opinion on that? So how do you see it from that point of view, that also governments are now moving more towards moving sensitive workloads towards AWS and Azure likewise vendors?
Yes, no, good question. I mean, it's more personal opinion indeed that I can share. Yeah. I can share what is my view on this. And being more generic, perhaps, not just this specific case, obviously moving to the cloud will give you more agility, right? You are using features and that will speed up your business. If you need to implement the same features in-house, that will take a budget that you might not afford, budget, but also indeed resources and time. And specifically for cybersecurity, also these big cloud providers, Amazon, Microsoft, all of them, they invest billions in cybersecurity protection. So I think my point is not, I want to question the security of the cloud providers because I think they are very secure just because of the budget that they have, but also the risks that they have. If there is a breach in AWS, the breach will not just be for ABN AMRO or any other single company, but might potentially be a breach for many companies. But what I'm questioning here today is how cloud providers are compliant in terms of privacy rules in Europe. Because indeed, cloud providers are investing a lot in cybersecurity, but they still don't see as a problem privacy. They're not investing fast enough in privacy compared to cybersecurity.
Cool, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Federico, for the presentation and the many questions. We are now almost at 8 o'clock. I don't see new questions, so I will suggest to thank you very much and end our session here.